Hello, Count Sacke here, back with another Genshin Impact video. Today, I will finally be doing the follow-up that I promised for my Is Average Crit Trustworthy video. We're not actually going to be in Genshin Impact, so I guess this is more of a math video? I don't know. Regardless, the point is, it's still related to Genshin Impact. First off, I kind of feel like an idiot now after reading some of your comments, because Taiga-chan and Denki2558. These people pointed out some ways to derive it, and well, this person uses weighted average, while this person uses, well, using something like mentioning something about calculating your damage by averaging your crit hits with your non-hit. But I found out a way that I think is more satisfying to me personally, and I think makes a lot of sense. So here I am in my drawing program, so the first I'm going to do is to actually introduce to you what the actual expected value formula is, or average value is. I did show it in the spreadsheet, but I didn't actually write down the equation. So this is what the equation is. The expected value, or if you don't know, it's basically the mean. For discrete sets, the expected value of x, if I can write the sigma properly, is this. It sums over all possible values that x can have, and it takes the sum of x times the probability that x happens to be equal to that specific value of x. So notice here the difference here. We have a capital X here. This just refers to a general event, whereas x, the lowercase one, refers to the possible values of x. So I guess, for example, we can say that x can be equal to many different values. Maybe it can be x1, it could be x2, it could be x3, and so on. The point is that this capital X can represents all of these events. And well, when we do the summation, what would actually happen is that we'll do x1 times the probability that the event occurring is x1, or whatever the event that's happening is x1. Then we have x2 times the probability that x is equal to x2. And I think you can sense the pattern. x3 times the probability that x is equal to x3. And it will continue on for the rest of the possible values. Maybe there's some final value. It will continue on until that last one. So the way I'm going to do it is by using the average damage formula. So to set this up, I want to actually kind of to do some notation here, because it will make our equations a little shorter. I'm going to write damage simply as a D, an uppercase D, like this. That way I'm not going to be writing too many things, and yeah, this expected value formula that I'm just going to calculate will have quite a bit of assumptions. The biggest assumption that I think we're going to talk about, or when I'm doing this derivation, is that damage only the damage is only dependent on crit or not crit. But I'm just going to write these assumptions as the capital letter A. So first off, we have the expected value of our damage given our assumptions. There's again, one of them is being that our damage only really relies on a few factors. Very few factors probably are crit, and whether or not our damage deals a crit hit or not. That is probably one of the main assumptions that we put here. Anyway, regardless, that is how we write the expected value of our damage. So now we have to sum over all possible values for our damage. Well, what are the two possible values that we can have for our damage? Well, that's pretty simple. We have that we can deal damage and we don't crit, and we multiply that by the probability that our damage happens to be equal to damage no crit. Given our assumptions, that is a slight difference. Don't mind this too much. It just says that we are assuming things, and there are various other dependencies in this, but they don't really change too much of the derivation. The point is, just notice the pattern here. So we're doing this, calculating this. Anyway, so the other possibility is that we do manage to deal a critical hit. So the other scenario is that we have damage crit, multiplied by the probability that our damage happens to be a critical hit damage. So let me properly write that down. Damage crit under our assumptions. So yeah, this is what we have so far. We have our expected value of our damage given our assumptions is equal to damage, equal to the damage when we don't crit times the probability that we deal that specific amount of damage plus plus damage when we crit times the probability of our damage when we do crit. Now, one of these might sound a little familiar. What is the probability that our damage is equal to our critical hit damage? This is essentially the same thing as asking, what is the probability that we deal a critical hit? So this term is exactly equal to our critical crit rate. So I'm just going to write this as CR. I'll put it as a subscript. So this is our crit rate. But what about this one? What is the probability that we don't crit? Well, one thing about probabilities is that if we have the probability that we do crit, let's say, well, if we consider the probability where we, let's say, don't crit, where we don't crit, let me write that more properly. Probability that we don't crit. This must always equal 100%. But the probability that we don't crit, if we do some basic algebra, will simply just be subtracting both sides, like this. This is the probability that we don't crit. And that's what this one is, the probability that we don't crit. So we can cancel this out, and we say that this is 1 minus our crit rate. There we go. So I'll just let's clean this up and continue on to our next line. So let's rewrite this again. Now, what can we do from here? Well, we know that our damage when we crit, try to write this on the side, our damage when we crit is equal to, well, is related to our damage when we don't crit. So it's equal to damage when we don't crit, but we multiply it by a factor. And what is that factor? It happens to be 1 plus our crit damage. Therefore, we now have a relationship between our crit and no crit. So we can now substitute this value for our damage crit. So let's again rewrite this. Now, hopefully some of you can actually see what's going on here. If you know anything about some math, let's just use some letters. If we have A times B, C, this is also equal to A times B plus A times C. Times C. So basically, we can bring out this A and bring it out and this is called factoring, where factor out A. So we'll do that with damage no crit. So sorry if I'm over explaining, but I just wanted to make my steps clear as to how I'm deriving this. Next, we want to do is to we can distribute the crit rate into this parentheses here. So let's do that. And well, since we have a negative, so we know that these two cancel out because it's adding and subtracting the same thing. So these cancel out, these become 0. And what do you know it? I'll now write this out as average There we go. So this term might look a little familiar, if you ask me. Because that is exactly what our average crit is. This is exactly average crit. And this is how I would personally derive the equation for average crit. So I would like to thank the people in the comments who actually pointed out how to derive it, and I do feel a little stupid for not realizing this a little sooner. It is a pretty simple derivation. You can see here, it's not even that many steps. So yeah, it does this by calculating the average damage, and then by seeing, hey, this is what our critical value hits on average are. Next thing I feel like I want to point out is a comment from Senel Clark 101. The modeled attack string Ningguang has pretty consistent and relatively close scalings. I'm interested in what will happen with the distribution and the accuracy of average crit damage if you try to model heavily skewed attack scaling distributions like Eula, where most of the damage distribution is skewed towards her burst proc. I personally also found this interesting as well, and I do think that there are quite a bit of people who are interested in seeing this. My problem is, I do not have Eula, so I can't really go out and test this myself. However, what I can do is, I looked up a video, so I found this video by Kekon from 2 years ago, and I took the stats from this person, and I looked at their Primo Geo Bishop run and compared values just to make sure I'm getting correct values, and well, I basically detailed a whole bunch of stuff to calculate things. Now, I'm not sure if some of you might notice something, but I did a whole burst rotation, and this is a lot of different cases. And, well, something about this kinda looks, if you ask me, quite a lot, and I mean a lot of different scenarios. So basically we have two possible scenarios here. So we have two possible scenarios here. We have two possible scenarios here. Two, we have three, then we have two here, three, two, 3, 2, and 2. If we take the product of all of this, you can see that it's pretty clear that for more complicated rotations, the method that I presented last time to calculate the damage, the distribution, is not very sustainable. It's going to be very difficult once you start to get to very big, very large rotations, very complex things. It's not sustainable. So, instead of doing, well, this, what I actually did is to let a computer do it for me. And that's exactly what I did. I programmed something in MATLAB to do it for me. First off, we have this matrix here. This matrix contains all the different possible values of damage that we can deal at different parts of the rotation. So this one is the elemental skill press. This is burst initial hit, normal attack 1, normal attack 2, and so on until we get to the final hit, which is lightfall. On the left side of the matrix, these are the values when Eula doesn't crit. On the right side is when she does crit. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate a rotation like this. And that is done with these for loops over here. And at the end of each rotation, well, I'm essentially calculating the total amount of damage. At the end of the, At the end of each rotation, I do calculate the amount of damage that is dealt each rotation. And then, well, what I do from here is plot it on a histogram, which is a damage frequency graph. I just make it a damage frequency graph, so just label stuff. I calculate the average damage. You don't really need to know what all of these things are in detail. The point is, we're simulating what a single rotation. Or if we do this with a sample count of 1, what we essentially do is run through the rotation a single time, and we calculate a damage value. So let's run this code right now. So in this case, we happen to do, this is, keep in mind the scale here, this is 10, you have to multiply this value by 10 to the 5, you have to multiply these values by 10 to the 5. So this is 164,000 damage. That is how much damage we did with a single hit. We could continue to run this like many times over and over, and you can see here we get different values. So we're getting ones that are like 15,000, 157,000. We're 170,000. Oh, this one is 159. It's not 100, 259,000. So yeah. But wouldn't you say this is kind of not really telling us anything? And even then, we're only calculating one single value. Well, what we have to do is, if we want to get an accurate value for our average damage, we need to increase our sample count. So let's increase our sample count by 100 times. So let's run through what I'm essentially doing with the sample count is running through the rotation 100 times. So let's run this code. So this is starting to look a little bit interesting, but I have to say this probability distribution is not exactly looking the most useful, so I'll go ahead and let's focus on the frequency graph. This is a histogram, so essentially if a value lies between its bin edges, so if the damage is between 150,000 and 180,000, we essentially count how many times damage has been dealt between those values. And that's what this histogram does, and that's why it's a frequency graph. So we can see here that there's times where we deal damage in the lower end, and there seems to be some damage that we do in the higher end. But it's still not exactly clear what our damage should be. So let's now, I think maybe it might be better if we try to consider 1,000 different combinations. Again, this distribution graph is not exactly the most useful, but now we're starting to see something a little bit more interesting. We're starting to see that these peaks kind of were like connected before, but now it's kind of separating. But that might just be due to the bin sizes. Don't think about it too much. The point is, we kind of have like this small, we have a smaller peak here and a larger peak here. And well, we're also starting to calculate values. If we take a look at the side here, we have average damage to be 239,000 damage, about 240,000. And this is interesting. So let's start, but I think even 1,000 might not be too accurate. Maybe we should consider 10,000, or maybe not even 10,000. Let's do 100,000. This is starting to, we're going through this rotation 100,000 times, and keep in mind the crit rate here. So yeah, let's do it. Might take a while, it's busy. Oh, we have a probability distribution, and hey, this is starting to look interesting. So essentially we have this peak and we have another peak here. I think we're starting to realize a trend here. So essentially we have this lower set of values and we have this higher set of values. So what's going on here? Well, before I try to explain what's happening here, let's focus back on the question. Is average damage going to be accurate? Or is using average crit to calculate average damage accurate? So here we have the average damage based on our simulation of 100,000 samples, or doing this rotation 100,000 times. Our average damage is 239,000 damage. So now let's go back to our spreadsheet. Here we can actually calculate our average damage. If we can run through all the different possible, average damage and average crit value damage and stuff. The point is, once we get through all of this, we sum over this, and we end up with 234,000 damage. Post-editing's sake here, I'm an idiot. The reason why it's a little bit different than what we expected is, well, I got my sum range wrong. I forgot to include this guy over here, which I think that's a pretty important thing. So this should actually be from B67 to O67, and now the value comes out to be a lot more closer to what we got in the simulation. I think it's pretty safe to say that we have a pretty good approximation of what our average damage is. There is a bit of discrepancy, but that could be due to randomness, it could be due to maybe I'm just not competent at calculating these average damage values. I could be wrong on these, to be honest. Who knows? Sorry, but yeah. I could be wrong on these. I am pretty new to theory crafting, so I'm sorry if I messed something up. Though if you want, again, you can... The person does show their build, so you can try to calculate it for yourself if you want, using the damage formula and stuff. So this is what Eula's probability distribution for her damage looks like. It looks something like this. We have this smaller peak on this end and a higher peak here. But hold on. Something that's kind of interesting. Why is it that this lower end here is well, there, and this one has a higher peak? Why is this one lower? Why is this one higher? Well, before I answer that question, I want to bring up a comment from Denki2558. Yes, the same person from earlier. They mentioned something about a bimodal distribution. So the bimodal distribution you showed in the end is kind of what it kind of looks like. A distribution of a single hit, which has exactly two values, a crit and a non-crit. So let's go ahead and look at what he's referring to. So if we take a look at this thing, we essentially kind of have like something that looks like two different peaks. We have a peak here and we have a peak here. One of them is taller, one of them is shorter. The point is, if we go kind of draw an approximation of what this looks like, where we have a tall peak with a dot like this, and we have a lower peak here. So the bimodal distribution that this person is referring to is the fact that we have two different peaks here. We have one peak here and another peak here. So we can see that we have this big lump here and another smaller but wider lump here. But why is it like this? This is because in the test, the single charged attack contributes about 50% motion value to the total damage, so it makes sense to see that distribution. That is a very interesting observation. Yes, the crit damage for Ningguang's charged attack does deal a ton of the damage. It is very reliant on that attack, so it does make a lot of sense that we would see two different spikes. One where the so this side is where the charge attack no crit. On this side, so let's put it here. This is for our charge attack no crit, and then this is when we have our charge attack crit. Likewise, I think it's also pretty self-explanatory that we have another thing going on with Eula. So with our Eula distribution, so I think it's pretty safe to say that this lower peak is when Lightfall does not crit. Lightfall no crit. Okay, and then this one is for when we do actually crit. So this one is for when we do crit. And that is exactly what is happening. Because Eula's damage relies heavily on her Lightfall attack, we're going to see that when she doesn't crit, we're going to end up in this lower end of damage. Whereas if Lightfall does crit, we're going to end up in this higher end of damage. Now, what's up with the peaks? How come in my Ningguang test, the peak the peak on the left, where there's less damage, is higher than the one where it does crit? And how come in the Eula's one, it's like this? Well, it's pretty simple to explain. My Ningguang's probability for crit rate is less than 50%. So it is expected to see that our distribution would be that more of the damage would be ending up in the lower ends of the values for our damage. So it's going to end up in the lower damage values. That is expected because I'm not doing as much crits. So that makes sense. Well, if we go back to our the Eula, this person has about a 70% crit rate. So it makes sense that we kind of end up seeing this sort of distribution. We have less damage on the lower end because this person is more likely to crit. This person is more likely to crit, so we end up dealing the higher end values more often. So now that begs the question, what happens when we actually change our crit rate? So this is going to look a little, I think this is going to look a little iffy, and I might want to lower our sample count a bit. So I'll go to, let's do we'll do 10,000 here. If we just take a look at what's happening here. So this graph, what's happening is that we're seeing what happens as our crit rate changes. So when we start from a crit rate of 10% and go to a crit rate of 9.9. So if you're wondering, but you might be wondering, what happens if we go to 100%? What happens when we go to 100%? Or what happens if we start with 0%? Well, we can do that. Well, for a second there, it just flashed. When you're at 0% crit rate, obviously you only do you don't crit anything, so all your damage values are just going to be one single thing. And the same thing happens when you have a crit rate of 100%. All of your attacks crit, so you always end up with one single attack, one single value for your damage. So this is exactly what's happening when we change our crit rate between those values. We can see how it evolves. So we have low crit rate right now, and we can see at some point, oh, we're getting more closer to 50%, and maybe this is about 50%, now it's going above 50%, and it may be 80, or not, maybe 70, 60, now we're about 90, and you can see that there's a difference between the two. This is what happens as your crit rate increases. Your distribution on the lower end is going to, well, increase. But hold on. This is only applicable if your damage is reliant on a single hit. If the most of your damage is reliant on a single hit. That begs the question, what happens if you don't have an attack that's dependent on a single hit? Take for example, Kokomi. Kokomi does not crit, or you can make her crit if you really try, but you're probably best off not doing that in the first place. For a character like Kokomi, because all of her hits don't really do critical, aren't really critical, you technically have only really get a single value out. You only really get a single value out, assuming theoretically that you'd perform the rotation perfectly. But if you want to be a bit more realistic and assume maybe some hits are going to hit, some hits aren't going to hit, maybe some hits, there's some more extra random variables to consider, you'll have a distribution which is much more like this. And this is a single peak. And it looks a lot like a normal distribution, which is to be expected because Kokomi has consistent damage. Kokomi doesn't really rely on, doesn't exactly rely on like critting and not critting. So we don't see these two different peaks that we get from like Ningguang's charge attack and Eula's lightfall. That's what we get here. Consistent damage. So this is what these probability distributions are useful for. They help us gauge the consistency of damage. So we can see here that because my crit rate is kind of low, well, I'm not too consistent at dealing large amounts of damage here. The area over here is smaller than the area over here, which is, again, to be expected. Again, whereas for this person has a higher crit rate, So they're expected to do higher amounts of damage since this area is much larger than this one. If we go back to our comments section now, someone also pointed out something here. Steno7955. He wanted to add on that the more your damage is spread out over many hits, the more your damage distribution will look like a normal curve, which is the central limit theorem. In this test, there's relatively few hits and a lot of damage is in a single hit, which is why the distribution is rather skewed. Again, we saw this already. Supposedly, if we repeat our rotation that we did for Ningguang, like many different times, we should see something that might start to look something like this. Hold on, something like that, approximately. And yes, that is actually true. But hold on. When I ran my Genshin simulation for Eula, how come I don't see this normal distribution? The damage frequency is still split up like this. Well, here's the thing. What Steno7955 is pointing out is something different. Because what ends up happening is, rather than considering a single rotation, so I actually did this for 5 times by hand. I did the same thing with Ningguang, the same 2 normal attack, 1 charge attack sequence 5 times. What this person is talking about is not this. It's not what we're doing with our simulation here. What this person is talking about is this. We are repeating our distribution. We're repeating our sequence a lot more times. And well, by doing that, we've also managed to increase the total number of possibilities by a whole lot as well. And let's just say I still did this by hand. So yeah, if we take a look at the number of scenarios, it's about 8,000. It's not as much as the 55,000, but it's there. Point is, if we take a look at our distribution now, wait a minute. By repeating this, we managed to get our normal, something that looks a bit more like our normal distribution. And guess what? Rather than also doing this by hand, I can also do this with, what's it called? I can also do this in simulation. So here I have my crit rate, I have the number of hits, which is the number of times the sequence is repeated, and the number of samples. What's the difference between our number of samples and our number of hits? Well, the point is, number of hits is the number of times that we do a rotation. It's kind of hard to explain it. Imagine that we do this 2 normal attack, 1 charge attack 100 times, and then calculate the total amount of damage that we did from that. That is what this program does. It's the same thing as before, so let's run this, let's run it. Okay, here we go, now we can see it. So we can kind of see that it's a bit faded, but the point is, it's because we're using the probability distribution point of view. We can kind of see that, hey, by doing this normal attack sequence 100 times, this 2 normal attack, 1 charge attack sequence 100 times, the amount of damage that we do is getting pretty consistent. It's a lot more consistent. And that is what the central limit theorem is telling us. It's starting to look a lot more like this normal distribution, which has only a single peak. And yeah, that actually makes sense. Because, well, it kind of just balances out. It kind of just balances out. Sometimes we do no crit, sometimes we do crit, and well, essentially by repeating this, we can add up our damage, and we'll get something that looks more like this. But hold on. So why are we suddenly getting different values? Why are we suddenly getting different values? Where did the bimodal distribution go? Well, this is why I mean by it's a bit misleading. Take a look at our damage on the x-axis. Hold on, why am I suddenly doing 295,000 damage? this is where it starts to be a bit misleading. This normal distribution only pops up if you consider the total amount of damage that you've dealt over all of those 100 rotations. Whereas the one that we did for this one is only a single rotation. This is why we're seeing values that are only from in the thousands, rather than considering an individual damage from the damage that you deal from a single rotation, each individual rotation. We're now starting to consider the damage over multiple rotations. Which, yeah, it might be better if you're trying, because like for example in the Spiral Abyss, you probably repeat your rotations like a fair amount of times. But I think this information from a single rotation is much more valuable than the one that we see from doing the rotation many times in a row. Why? Because I can see, hey, on average, or maybe not on average, but most of the time I'm going to end up doing 2,591 damage. That is what I'm going to be doing most of the time. And that actually makes a lot more sense. Or maybe it might also be more reasonable to say, hey, about half of the time I'm going to be doing damage that about half of the time I'm going to be doing damage which is less than maybe about 2,750 damage. About half of the time, and the other half is going to be above that. If you're really interested in these theory crafting videos and talking about probability distributions, I do also talk a bit more about probability, and with this video you can see here from mine, analyzing 150 plus million wishes to find the average pity. You can take a look at that video if you're more interested in learning a bit more about probabilities, and you can also learn some things about the different limited time banners and the permanent banner from this video, so you can check that out if you want to learn a bit more about statistics and stuff. Shameless self-promo. Well, it's my video, it's my channel, what do you expect? Anyway, enough about that. I think, yeah, that's really about it for now, so thanks for watching and hope you've enjoyed. Dear goodness, I've been talking for an hour, my voice